This is EntheoVision in association with the Thank You Plant Medicine movement, raising awareness to bring you research, news, and real-life insights on plant medicines and their potential for your future. My name's Carol Talbot, and in this episode, Oregon, paving the way for other countries and states to introduce regulated psychedelic therapy. Suicide, how one woman's suicidal thoughts propelled her to take a stand in her community, and more. And finally, I'll be sharing some insights into the Mexican Curandera, who first shared the secret of mushrooms with a businessman back in the 1950s. How does a modest little mushroom upend the brain so thoroughly? According to a 2014 study, Psilocybin actually boosts the brain's connectivity. People describe mushroom or psilocybin trips as actually profound experiences and report feelings of joy and connectedness to others and to the world around them. Even back in the 1960s, Harvard psychologist Timothy Leary and his colleagues ran a series of experiments with magic mushrooms called the Harvard Psilocybin Project. More recently, a landmark study conducted by the Berkeley Imperial Research Program provided the first clinical evidence for efficacy of psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy to treat depression, even in cases where all other treatments had failed. They gave oral psilocybin to 20 patients with treatment-resistant depression, all of whom had previously tried at least 2 other treatment methods without success. Participants had suffered from depression for an average of 18 years, with severity ranging from moderate to severe. All patients showed some reduction in their depression scores at 1 week post-treatment, and maximal effects were seen at 5 weeks, with results remaining positive at 3 and 6 months. It's these kind of studies that inspired therapists in Oregon, along with the country's leading advocates in the field, to write Measure 109. Measure 109 asked the Oregon Health Authority to create a licensing system, to create a regulated program where Oregon residents suffering from depression, anxiety, and other challenges, they can see a trained facilitator to receive supervised psilocybin therapy. I spoke to Tom Eckert, who's been part of this campaign, about the latest news around Measure 109.
So here in Oregon, we just passed Measure 109, creating access to psilocybin-assisted therapy. Very exciting. We also passed a Measure 110, that decriminalizes all substances across the board and moves toward a public health approach to substances rather than a criminalized model. So putting those together, we have a brand new horizon here in Oregon that we think is a real template to move across the country and potentially the world. Just thank you to the whole community. It's just been such an inspirational experience throughout the team here in Oregon, the volunteers, and the 1.3 million people who voted yes on Measure 109.
So this means that Oregon has made history by successfully creating the first ever statewide program for psilocybin therapy in the USA. So what's the next step for Oregon?
Right, so with the psilocybin therapy component here, we're moving into a 2-year development period. And so a lot's going to happen during that period. There's no therapy that's going to be happening right away. This is going to take a little while because we want to get it right. And there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of infrastructure we want to build. This is a legal framework, a licensing system that includes facilitators and training programs and production of psilocybin products, both organic and potentially other methods. So I think the first thing that's going to happen is the appointment of an advisory board of experts from varied disciplines that are relevant to psilocybin therapy, psychedelic therapy. And they will convene, appointed by the governor here in Oregon, with recommendations, of course, coming from the community and the campaign. And so that will start the dialogue, and they will begin to kind of develop the criteria for the licenses, the criteria for approving training programs, things of that nature.
I also asked Tom if this will have an impact on Oregon's economy.
I think it will. And I think there's potential for Oregon to become kind of a world center for psychedelic therapy. Of course, this is going to spread. It won't always stay that way, but we've taken a step here that's going to put us on the map, and we embrace that. You know, we'd love to see therapy centers, retreat centers, a practitioner community develop here. The measure is flexible enough to allow for different kinds of access points. So community-based practitioners, individual practitioners, retreat centers, larger centers, group work, individual work. So there will be a lot going on. And the neat thing is that the regulations are really about protecting the safety, practice standards, and ethical standards. But that can be brought into the culture in different ways, because, you know, different populations are kind of looking for different things. If you've never done psychedelic therapy before and you're maybe an end-of-life patient, perhaps you're looking for a more clinical environment for a sense of kind of safety and familiarity, where someone else may be looking for a ceremonial environment and be more interested in consciousness exploration and the kind of aesthetic around that. All of it's possible. And that's kind of the open marketplace, is that different centers will come up that have different vibes, but they all adhere to core standards, which we think is so important.
By the way, other countries and states are taking an interest in what's happening with Oregon as a model for introducing psychedelics. And as neuroscientist Addie Ray said, Measure 109's framework prioritizes safety, research, licensing, and training in a way that promotes access, treatment, and health. More recently, studies at leading medical research institutions such as Johns Hopkins, UCLA, and NYU indicate that psilocybin therapy shows real promise. It appears to be uniquely effective in treating depression, end-of-life anxiety, and addiction. And in particular, psilocybin has been found to reduce symptoms of obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and recent evidence shows that psilocybin can be highly effective for smoking cessation and can lead to positive changes in personality, such as increases in empathy, openness, consciousness. For Melissa Lavasani, psilocybin gave her back her life and also inspired her to set up Initiative 81 in Washington, D.C.
I had watched a few of my friends be on antidepressants, and I've slowly watched their personalities change over the years. And, you know, I've heard their struggles with trying to find the right pharmaceutical medication, and it really terrified me. I also had a friend who took his own life because he could never find a solution. So I opted to go the natural route from the very beginning, which, you know, is challenging when you're dealing with an issue like severe depression and anxiety and suicidal thoughts. It basically went untreated for a long time, and I spiraled out of control. And I was introduced to psilocybin through a podcast done by Joe Rogan, which featured Paul Stamets. A friend of mine who dealt with his own depression issues, you know, heard the podcast. He was a regular Joe Rogan fan and said, you know, you have to listen to this because this is mind blowing. Prior to this, I had zero experience with psychedelics, even recreationally. It was, you know, I assumed people that took drugs like this were just trying to escape reality, and couldn't deal with adult life. But lo and behold, that was me. I couldn't deal with adult life, and just thinking about it in a different frame as medicine, it kind of flipped my world around. So at that point in time, it was clear that I was suicidal, and I was going to take my life if something hadn't changed. I was driving my family, I was just failing at everything. My husband and I were really disconnected. I wasn't engaged with my children. And so we began to grow in our home because, as you know, spores are legal to purchase in the US. For scientific purposes, but you can't cultivate anything with them. So it's kind of like this loophole that you can get through. But we began growing, and for me, microdosing was a good introduction. I wasn't totally comfortable with doing a full trip. And, we weren't talking about this with anybody. We were growing a Schedule I drug in our home, which the same home where our children live. And, my husband and I both work for local Washington, D.C. government. So we were somewhat public people. People knew who we are. And I was really uncomfortable. We didn't talk about it with anybody. So it was kind of like a guessing game a lot. I would do research on the internet to see, what works and what didn't work, and what dosage I needed to use, and how I needed to schedule my dosage. But it was really a guessing game for me. But within a matter of like 3 days, I was starting to feel the effects of the microdosing. It was very minor changes to, including just like how I held my body up and how I walked and how I talked. And my husband noticed it, and he was like, whoa, this is really meaningful. And I can't believe that my wife, who has been gone basically for 2 years, I battled with severe depression. The psilocybin worked. So I was thinking, well, maybe this other plant would work for me as well. I took a chance, and after just like 3 ayahuasca ceremonies, which also incorporated San Pedro, and I felt like myself again, and it was the most amazing feeling. And I was so moved by how quickly I healed that. And I was watching the Denver psilocybin campaign happening at the same time. I was like, well, why can't DC do something like this as well? My husband and I knew a lot of the people within DC government, especially DC Council, the legislature, that, we thought we would use our contacts to, work something in the background to get something passed. We eventually started to connect with people in the movement and had various meetings with people, but our assumption was never that I would be the face of this thing in DC. We just wanted to help out in the background. I'm not a activist. I'm not a political person, but I do know how to navigate through our government here. I have a master's degree in public policy, so I figured that, it would be perfect work for me to be involved in. However, when the dots kind of lined up, and, we were in front of the right people, and I was in front of David Bronner's people that he works with in DC for a lot of the other kinds of drug reform activism that he's participated in. They said that, they were like, well, you're the perfect person for this. You've got this story that's just so, kind of heart-wrenching and so relatable to people, that why don't you just propose this initiative? And I was really hesitant. I didn't want to be the face of this. I was really afraid of what people would think about me, honestly. I'm a mom, and I was worried that, my kids would be ostracized in school because they think I'm like this druggy parent that's putting my children in harm's way. And it took a long time for me to, kind of say, well, yeah, I do need to take on this role. I mean, I actually said no to it flat out. And, I went to bed that night, and I couldn't sleep. I got really upset. And I said, something in me is telling me that I need to take this on in my city. And we submitted the paperwork in December, right before we left for the holiday. And, we didn't talk about it to anybody. We didn't talk about it to our friends or our family or anything. It was just like, it took that much time to process what was about to happen to our lives. And, in January, when we came back from the holiday in 2020, it was kind of like, well, let's kick this off. We kicked off the campaign. There were friends of mine, very close friends, who had no idea I went through any of this, had no idea the severity of my depression, had no idea I was using psilocybin and ayahuasca to help me out.
Despite the COVID-19 pandemic and shutdown, Initiative 81 supporters safely collected more than 25,000 valid signatures from registered DC voters to place the measure on the November ballot. And news recently in is that Initiative 81 has secured enough votes from DC residents to pass. This means that DC residents benefiting from plant and fungi medicines are not police targets. So well done, Melissa and the team at Initiative 81. And to find out more, you can visit decrimnaturedc.org. Maria Sabina was a Mexican curandera, or sabia, which means one who knows. And it was Maria that first shared the secret of mushrooms with banker R. Gordon Wasson when he traveled to Mexico way back in 1955. As a healer and shaman, Maria had been consuming psilocybin mushrooms regularly since she was 7 years old and had performed the mushroom ceremony for over 30 years before Wasson arrived. Wasson wrote an article about his experiences, and actually, if it weren't for this article, the sacred mushroom may have remained a mystery. Thousands of spiritual seekers, including the likes of John Lennon and Bob Dylan, sought out Maria Sabina and her little children, the name she affectionately used for the sacred mushrooms. Dr. Timothy Leary said, "I learned more about my brain and its possibilities and more about psychology in the 5 hours after taking these mushrooms than in the preceding 15 years of studying and doing research in psychology." And now, mushrooms, or psilocybin, is being used in a manner much, much closer to what Maria Sabina considered to be their true purpose, which is simply to heal the sick. If you have a story to share about how plant medicine has transformed your life or involved in studies or research, then please send in your press release and information to press@thankyouplantmedicine.com and one of the team will connect with you. Coming up in the next episode, ketamine, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and how a lack of fulfillment led to the making of the documentary Reality of Truth. I'm Carol Talbot for EntheoVision in association with the Thank You Plant Medicine movement. Remember, the generosity of the earth enriches our lives.